Here we go. Okay. Good Yontiv, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to all those who are here. Welcome to all those who are afar, watching us and participating. We won't be able to have you ask questions, but I'm sure many of your questions will be asked either by me or Mara Bernstein, to whom I want to express gratitude, our Director of Programming, and Rabbi Lori Kaufman, who will be teaching us during the Mincha service, but the newest member of our Park Avenue senior staff, our Director of Content Innovation, and to you and to your family, we wish you a sweet and health-filled year, and thank you for your leadership. This is an annual tradition of ours. Dr. Haas, you can't get a high holiday seat better than this. I mean, I just want to point out that, but it does require an hour of giving of your expertise. To those who don't know, Dr. Richard Haas is a veteran diplomat, a prominent voice on American foreign policy, and an established leader of nonprofit institutions. He is in his 18th year, that's high, as president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an independent, nonpartisan membership organization, think tank, publisher, and educational institution dedicated to being a resource to help people understand the world and foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. Dr. Haas has extensive additional government experience, including Special Assistant to President George H.W. Bush, Senior Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council, and he served in the Department of State and Defense and was a legislative aide in the United States Senate. Dr. Haas holds a bachelor's degree from Oberlin, a master's and doctorate of philosophy from Oxford. He's received numerous honorary degrees. He is the author and editor of 14 books on American foreign policy and one on management. His latest book is A World, A Brief Introduction, published by Penguin Press. His greatest achievement is being married to Susan and the father of Francesca and Sam, and he is a proud card-carrying member of your synagogue and mine, Park Avenue Synagogue. So, welcome, Dr. Haas.
Thank you, Rabbi Cosgrove.
So welcome back. We do this every year. And let me start out with a softball. The world has changed and the world is the same, right? Donald Trump is no longer president. Joe Biden is. So in some ways, the world is very different, but in some ways it feels the same. We're still dealing with COVID, a worsening climate crisis, rising tensions with China. Can you situate us in our present moment? How is our moment different, perhaps, than last Yom Kippur?
I'll do that, or at least I'll try to do that. First, though, I just want to thank you. This is a sanctuary in the physical sense, but it really has been a sanctuary over the last 18 months. You know, we've all been struggling with COVID. We've all been scattered. And this has been one of the anchors for our family and for me personally, so thank you. And thank also Cantor Schwartz and others. It's, we're all looking for connections in this world, and this is an important one. So let me try to, the answer is there's more continuity than change, much more than is often recognized. But before I get granular, let me just try to give three big things going on out there. One is that we're continuing and indeed increasingly trying to deal with something that's pretty familiar in my line of work, which is great power rivalry. With Russia, with China, it's more intense than it was a year ago, with both. And what's a little bit different is not simply the greater intensity, but China represents a qualitatively different sort of thing than we're used to. During the Cold War, 4 decades, we competed with Russia. Russia was largely separate in many ways, particularly economically. What's so interesting about China is that many of the countries with whom we're closest to in security, our allies, their biggest economic partner is China. And we don't have a clear playbook for dealing with this type of a great power rival. So that's, again, but I'd say all things being equal, the great power rivalry is more intense today than it was a year ago or 2 years ago. Secondly, and in some ways, the service was remarkably current. When you ask, who's going to perish by fire, Who's going to perish by flood? Who by plague? Well, this is a world of floods and fires and plagues. And what these all have in common, and we just marked 9/11, these are manifestations of globalization. And I would argue that what's different than a year ago, and even more different from, you say, Yom Kippur 5 or 10 years ago, is the intensity of these. It's their prevalence. Obviously, COVID. I mean, the real deaths already around the world are probably 12, 15 million. The official numbers are way, way low for various reasons. Global health challenges more generally, but climate change. The report that came out a month or two ago by these scientists, that the temperature of the world's already gone up by roughly 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Even if tonight the world turned on a dime and suddenly we stopped emitting gases that trap heat, it would still go up another degree Fahrenheit over the next couple of decades, which would make 3 degrees, 1.5 Celsius. It's not going to happen, though. We're not going to turn on a dime. And climate change, when we think of it as far off, well, it's arrived, and we're seeing it. People are beginning to die from it. The economic impact is enormous. We're seeing the fires, the floods, the intensities of the storms, and it's simply one of the examples of globalization that's arrived. And I'd say what's depressing about the last year, and I should, if you haven't figured out already, I'm probably the most depressing member of the congregation. So hopefully in future years, the rabbi will find more positive people to turn to.
Your last name's not Goldstein.
No, but I think Goldstein's come. The Goldstein and the extended family is here now. The gap between where the world is and where it needs to be has not closed. And that's the challenge in some ways for the future, is how do we narrow this gap between these challenges and our responses, because we need collective responses to these collective challenges, and we're not there yet. And then last but not least, what's both, again, more similarity than I would have thought, Rabbi, is the United States. And again, it's hard to argue we're better off. We're so divided politically. When people ask me all the time, what's the biggest challenge facing the United States? Is it China? Is it Russia? Is it Iran? Is it North Korea? Is it Hezbollah? I say, yeah, those are all big challenges, but the biggest challenge is us. Many of us are old enough to remember the old Pogo cartoon. We've met the enemy, and it is us. And it's our divisions here politically and socially. It's a society where, I don't know if you saw the poll that just came out, I think it was today from the University of Chicago, but a surprising number of people feel that the use of violence is now warranted in American society in order to fulfill or realize their political goals. So we've got this world of this somewhat familiar, somewhat different, great power challenges. We've got all these global issues, and we're more divided here at home. And I think that's what makes for a difficult time. And I can't sit here and say there's been progress over the last year. I actually think we've lost some ground.
And that's the program for today.
But that'll drive people to prayer.
Right. To make sure, exactly.
I'm your warm-up
Because if Dr. Haas can't solve it, then maybe Cantor Schwartz can. So, all right, you've tagged a lot. China, climate change, toxicity here in the, okay, so let's take it one by one. But I actually want to begin with what I think is the headline moment right now, which is 20 years since 9/11 and the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Has this shifted? This is obviously a moment. I'm wondering if you feel this is the end of an era or an end or a shift in U.S. foreign policy, and how you assess what this signals. I want to get to another question on Afghanistan, but just what this signals right now as far as understanding the Biden administration and otherwise.
Well, first of all, I've been obviously downbeat. One thing one can say is over the last 20 years, thank God, there's not been any global attack, terrorist attack, remotely on the scale of 9/11. And it's not because the terrorists have found another line of work. It's because in many ways we and others have gotten better. We made mistakes that made 9/11 in some ways possible, And if we look at ways we've lashed up our intelligence and police and military, we've coordinated better with other countries, we've taken the fight to them, I think that there's been some real progress. Indeed, one of the most overused phrases in the world, in my business is international community. There are some elements of community, though, against terrorism. Even the United States and some countries with whom we don't normally get along, there's some degree at times of intelligence sharing and cooperation. So there, I think, some progress. No, it doesn't end. There's no battleship Missouri in the war on terrorism. So it's going to continue as long as people are willing to kill and die for their cause. And unfortunately, there's too many people willing to do that around the world. I think the biggest impact may be on American foreign policy and the decision to expand greatly what we were doing in Afghanistan and to initiate the war in Iraq. And it's not just, if you add the two together, the 7,000 Americans who lost their lives, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of others, the trillions of dollars. But I think it also had a big impact on how Americans view American foreign policy. And I think it had a big impact on how others around the world view the United States. So I think more, in some ways, more significant than 9/11 are things that were done in its wake. And I think we are still living with the consequences of that. And, I'll just put my cards on the table. My own view is that we mostly got it wrong in some of our responses, in our larger responses in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And I think historians will be pretty critical. But that said, we are where we are. This administration has turned a corner, obviously, in Afghanistan. In Iraq, we have several thousand American troops. They're now no longer involved in combat. And the question is whether the government there can hold. It's still something of a bulwark against Iranian influence, so we'll see. But the era in which the Middle East and the era in which the so-called global war on terrorism have dominated American foreign policy, that era has pretty much come to an end.
So I can ask you about this because you've written about it publicly. You were publicly critical, saying that leaving Afghanistan was a regrettable withdrawal of choice. And so I was wondering, not just, you mentioned why you feel that way, but now, and someone submitted a question, what do we do to ensure, or can we do anything that the leadership in Kabul can be in dialogue with the United States and accountable to, I believe, the 2020 agreement?
Yeah, when you talk about Afghanistan, I think it's useful to just distinguish between the decision to withdraw, which was what you might call a strategic policy decision, and then the mechanics of the implementation of withdrawal. And a lot of the conversation is about this Air Force base versus that. But I actually think the bigger issues were the question of the previous administration to sign an agreement with the Taliban, not with the government of Afghanistan, in February of 2020, which promised American troop withdrawal in just over a year. Actually asked very little of the Taliban in return. Asked them not to traffic with terrorists. They agreed not to attack U.S. forces directly, but they weren't required to disarm. They weren't required to commit to a ceasefire. I note this simply because one of the hats I once wore years ago, I was the U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. We asked more of the provisional IRA then than we ever asked of the Taliban in Afghanistan. It really wasn't a peace agreement. It was an American withdrawal agreement. The Biden administration, though, decided to honor it, changed it by a few months, nothing more. Again, the president was determined to close this chapter of American foreign policy. There's still, we got a lot of people out. There's a lot of people there, few Americans, some dual nationals, a lot of Afghans who work with us, a lot of Afghans, even if they didn't work with us, who are vulnerable. Now, we don't quite know what the new Afghanistan is going to be. It's hard to make generalizations. People talk about the Taliban as if it's IBM and centralized and organized. It's almost easier to talk about Talibans. It's very loose-knit. There's not that there's good guys, but there's extremists, and then there's really extremists. And so we'll see, and we'll see what the responsibilities of governing, whether in any way that mellows them. They have tremendous needs. The humanitarian, this is a country of 40 million people. We're now beginning to get close to colder weather in the country. Millions of people are at risk. There's all sorts of people who are displaced. There's not a functioning economy. So the question is, how do these circumstances, how do they affect the willingness of the new leadership to essentially do some of the things that we would like them to do or not do others? I don't have answers to it, but I think if I were in government, I would at least explore it. I think it's silly to assume they're going to be Taliban 2.0 are going to be Jeffersonian Democrats. I think it's silly to assume that there's nothing that could be done with these people. So my view is let's at least explore the potential for a transactional relationship.
Okay. I'm going to shift gears, and there will be time for questions for follow-up on any of the topics we're touching on. I want to turn to China by way of an anecdote, because I really know nothing about it, other than the following story that happened to me. I was on the plane this summer traveling from point A to point B, and I sat next to this guy who sells electronics. And I was asking him why there's a delay on certain phones and computers, and he was telling me the story that pretty much every chip in a widescreen TV and otherwise, all the things that we depend on are all made in China, and that this is and I went very dark because I realized that this is a resource. This is the air we breathe as a Western country, and that I'm just trying to understand this world in which now it's not oil, right? It's not all our cars, but it is all that we do. All of our iPhones are in the hands of a country, and we haven't built those things here domestically if, God forbid, the train goes off the tracks here. So I'm just wondering if you can unpack, and if, God forbid, things do go dark, what is a Biden administration taking a different tact than there are a lot of questions here than the Trump administration? Is this something that Republicans and Democrats see eye to eye on, or is there a divide on how to deal with the challenge of China?
Okay, let me slightly unpack it, if I might.
Yeah.
One is a phenomenon that goes way beyond China, which you were getting at, which is supply chains. Virtually nothing comes from just one place. An iPhone or other things, an automobile, has things in it from literally maybe more than 100 countries. It may cross borders dozens, if not hundreds of times in the course of its being produced. So you can imagine a world where there could be COVID, which shuts down a port, or there could be an earthquake or a flood or some kind of an accident, and suddenly parts that are produced in one or two places, everything slows down. And that's what's happening in the world right now. So the fact that so many things, if you want to buy a car now, either you can't get it or it's several $1,000s more expensive. In large part, it's not because of China, it's because of Taiwan. The most advanced chips in the world are largely made in Taiwan, and productivity was scaled back, and now production was scaled back, and now we got a chip shortage. And where we don't have chip shortages, we have ports that can't function, and so forth. So that's what's going on. So it's almost sand in the gears of trade and globalization. So that's one thing. I think the China challenge, that's not unique to China. That's another part of globalization, that everything is interconnected. What's different about China, again, is here's this country of 1.4 billion people, the world's second largest economy overall. And it's emerged in many ways, tremendous power now, economic power, its diplomatic reach with the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, militarily building up. It's become much more assertive in its foreign policy and its military actions, much more repressive at home. There was a lot of talk 10, 15 years ago that as China got bigger economically, we brought it into the World Trade Organization, that China was going to open up politically and open up economically, become more of a market economy, a more open political system. Just the opposite's happened. China's actually become more statist economically and more repressive politically. China has a tradition since Mao of collective leadership. Now the leader of China is the most powerful individual since Mao. It's a return to individual leadership, a move away from collective leadership. So China's trajectory has not panned out to put it bluntly. And the challenge for us and others is how do we push back against China where we have to? Hopefully, though, how do we avoid conflict in the process? And how do we not rule out an ability to still cooperate with them where it might make sense, say in doing something on North Korea or doing something in Afghanistan? People don't realize it. China's one of the 6 countries to directly border on Afghanistan. It could have some influence there, obviously about climate change. So it's a really tough relationship. But you're right, your going in position, there's actually probably 80 to 90% continuity, just like there was on Afghanistan. 80 to 90% continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Why? Because the change, the emergence of a much tougher approach to China emerged under Trump. And in some ways it reflected a disillusionment with China that became pervasive in the foreign policy establishment, which is why now you see that same continuity under Biden. Now, we'll have to see what happens with some of the details about Taiwan or some other issues. But clearly, we're now entering an era where we're going to try to become more economically self-sufficient in some areas. We are going to try to become less reliant on China in certain areas, try to deny China certain technologies in others. And again, the question is, can we have a more competitive adversarial relationship that doesn't spill over into conflict, that doesn't preclude desirable cooperation? And I don't know. It's going to be a neat trick if we can pull it off. Takes 2 to tango, for better and for worse. But that to me, as much as any other question, that's going to determine the character of this era of history. If the United States and China can manage this complicated relationship, it's a very different future than if they cannot.
All right. So I have 2 huge topics, same question, which is how would you preliminarily reflect on the Biden administration's approach to COVID, successes and failures, and climate successes and failures?
COVID, I'd say it's mixed in ways I wouldn't have expected in some ways. One is obviously the initial ramping up of production and distribution was phenomenal. And I used to say it was the most important national security thing we were doing because it got this economy moving in the right direction, the society, restored America's reputation for competence, and it's and the previous administration deserves some credit with the acceleration of the production of vaccines, and the private sector. What places like Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, just extraordinary. I mean, can you imagine what we'd be going through? We would not be here, to say the least, if it were not for particularly this new generation of vaccines. So the technology is really, it's in every sense, it saved us. And so I think those are the good things. Where I think the administration is clearly, unexpectedly, they would say, has hit a wall with the American society, that we still have such a large number and percentage of us who refuse to get vaccinated. The administration was hesitant in dealing with the vaccine, hesitant to mandate things. It was hoping it wouldn't have to, and we lost months. And the answer is, I would argue we should have done it sooner. We still haven't gone far enough now. The idea that you can still get on a plane without a vaccine, I think, is wrong. So people can retain the choice not to get vaccinated, but what we ought to make clear are the consequences. We have proven safe, effective vaccines. And anyone who's claiming that the vaccines are neither safe nor effective is trafficking in falsehoods, in fake news, to use the Dalebirds. So I think that I would put a bigger accelerant in that. The other area we've been really disappointing is on vaccine exports. I mean, yes, we've done more than any other single country, but we've still done so little. You've got roughly close to 8 billion people in the world. Do the math. If people need 2 shots, that's 16 billion shots. We're not even a fifth of the way there. And what we're learning is when people over there aren't vaccinated, the mutants, the variations emerge and come here. So we want to be vaccinating the world, not simply as a humanitarian thing. Let me hasten to add, not that I'm against humanitarian things, but it's a way to get them back on their feet economically, and it's a way to protect ourselves. And we simply haven't made a priority, and for head-scratching reasons at times. But I just think there's just more we and others need to do. Call it enlightened self-interest, but that's what it needs to be. On climate, There's been a bigger split with the previous administration, no denial of the science. You've got a special envoy, the former Secretary of State, bigger government emphasis on spending on green technology. And in about, mid-September. In 6 weeks, you're going to have a big conclave in Glasgow. It's going to be the next big global climate. I'm pretty pessimistic on what they're going to achieve. Every country is still voluntarily setting its own ambitions. There's nothing more. And in particular, what I think would be the single best tool to get countries to act more responsibly would be through trade agreements to basically say, if you want to export a car to us, but you use fossil fuel, say coal, to make the steel in the car, you're going to have to pay a high tariff. But that would mean that we would push for that, and that would mean we would join some of the most important trade agreements in the world. But here again, there's continuity. Neither the Trump administration nor the Biden administration will join the most significant new trade agreements in the world. So we are denying ourselves what I would think is the most single effective tool on climate. So the rhetoric is good. Directionally, we're right. What worries me is the pace is not going to be there. And it's not just us. Even worse is China. China's still producing and exporting coal plants. So again, the world is not seized with climate. And what worries me, and I think it's actually the biggest single problem out there, because there's not, I don't see the equivalent of Pfizer or Moderna against climate, that by the time we can't kick it down the road anymore, it's going to be a bit too late. And we're actually entering that area now with these storms and floods, the heat, quite extreme. We were just out west. Susan and I were there for a wedding a few days ago. And you're beginning to see big parts of this country, the assumptions that people had when they bought their homes 10 years ago in the far west and the mountain west, those assumptions are actually being challenged. It is going to change the way we live, and also in coastal areas, it'll change the way we live for other reasons, with water and floods. But I don't think this administration is talking the talk about climate. I don't think it's yet walking the walk.
So let's keep pivoting. The Biden administration campaigned on a promise to rejoin the Iran deal. But here we are now, and it doesn't seem like that's happening. What's the end game here? Is diplomacy possible? Is a nuclear Iran inevitable? Is there an emergent policy that you can see from point A to point B?
Again, it was another, at the surface, split between the previous administration, which called the 2015 nuclear deal the worst agreement ever negotiated. My own enthusiasm for it was finite. I don't think it was nearly ambitious enough in what it required. It was narrow in its coverage and too short in its durations, I would argue. I think we had more leverage than we essentially used. That's the deal we signed on to. So even though I wasn't wild about it, I also disagreed with the decision of the previous administration to unilaterally exit it. Anyhow, again, we are where we are. This administration wants to get back in. Nothing could happen until you had the new election in Iran emerge. It's not clear whether the United States and Iran can agree on getting back in. But let me say the following, that even if the United States and Iran can reach agreement, it doesn't in any way influence Iran missile capabilities or support for Hezbollah or support for terrorism or anything it does in the Persian Gulf. It deals with its nuclear program, which is not insignificant, but it's a narrowly focused agreement. So it doesn't, quote unquote, solve the Iran problem. Indeed, if we were to get back in the deal, it exacerbates all the non-nuclear parts of the Iran problem, because billions of dollars of resources would become available to Iran because many of the sanctions would disappear. So it's essentially a bit of a trade. We will make some things worse while we buy some time on the nuclear thing. The problem is the time we buy on the nuclear, I think, again, is too short-lived. So I think it's a question of when and not if, whether we get back into the deal or not. Iran puts into place all the prerequisites of nuclear weapons. And I don't know if it puts itself a week away, an hour away, a month away, but Iran will have everything it will need to be a nuclear weapon state. Whether it decides to go it's almost like running a marathon, the last mile of that marathon. So I think it's a question of when, not if. We, Israel, Saudis, and other countries, UAE and others, are going to have to decide, is that tolerable? Or if not, do we try to do things to head that off? Or if not, if it emerges all the same, what do we do with it? So I actually think we've probably passed the point where getting back into the 2015 agreement changes where we're ultimately going to end up vis-a-vis Iran. And my own view is also Iran, given its sense of self, its history, I believe they will one day, they will not deny themselves. They will not enter into agreements, or if they do, they won't honor them, that would shut off that kind of a path. So it's going to really be up to the United States, Israel, and others, and to decide. And I would just say for us, this is happening when? At a time when we have made the strategic decision, again across 2 administrations, to dial down our involvement in the Middle East. So we've decided that we're a little bit tired of the Middle East. It's absorbed too much of our energies, just at a time where Iran is in many ways continuing to emerge as a geopolitical threat in the Middle East. And there's a tension in that, and how that's going to be resolved, either we're going to have to change, or the countries of the region are going to take on more of a role themselves. But the one thing I don't think is going to happen, I don't think Iran's going to change.
So I have 2 more, I could ask you thousands of questions. I have 2 more big buckets, but I want to, which is my cue to everyone there, that if you're thinking of questions to follow up, you can start thinking about it. So my most philosophically minded question, America's standing in the world. You wrote, one of the titles of a book you wrote was Foreign Policy Begins at Home. And so the divides, the contested elections, the toxicity here in the States, and added to that the fact that we just withdrew from Afghanistan and whatever isolationist tendencies that have we lost our standing as a dependable, right? That can we talk the talk if we ourselves aren't walking the walk as leaders in foreign policy?
So let me give you a slightly nuanced answer. Look, this is not the first time we have shown a degree of unreliability. The Trump administration did it with the Kurds when they were abandoned in Syria. The Obama administration did it when it told Mr. Assad, if you cross that, if you use chemical weapons, that crosses a red line. There'll be hell to pay, and he did it, and there wasn't hell to pay. So, you know, the United States did what it did in the 70s in Vietnam. So we've been consistently inconsistent to some degree. So I think others have taken that on board, but it's more serious now. It's happening more frequently, and people see the domestic divisions and a bit of a lurch. I think particularly if you look at the Trump administration, at least the perception of it, that they're not quite sure exactly whether we are reliable and dependable. They're not quite sure who we are.
Right, but you lose your moral voice. Like if you tell someone to watch what they're eating as they're shoving Oreos in, I mean, like it doesn't work.
There's look, it's very hard for us to advocate for democracy given the state of ours, given January 6th, given our inability to deal with most of our domestic challenges. I mean, if you were a young person coming of age and trying to form your political views in country X, and you had various models out there, it's not obvious to me that this young person would choose American democracy as the model they would want to bring to their own country. So it's not just that we're losing the moral high ground, I think we're losing the effectiveness high ground in some ways to China. The moral high ground is more nuanced. You know, we continue to show our ability to deal with our flaws. In some ways, that's the saving strength of a democracy. It's not that you don't make mistakes, but that you have the ability to deal with them and correct them. And I think that is potentially still out there. But it's very hard now to advocate for human rights, given what's going on in Afghanistan. More broadly, it's hard to advocate for it or do a lot about it. Just so if Mr. Navalny, he's been jailed by Putin. If he gets killed tomorrow in some Russian prison, what are we going to do then? We have, all of our nuclear arms control relations with Russia. We have NATO concerns. Or if China tomorrow continues to do what it does vis-a-vis the Uyghurs, or they violated their commitment to honor the separateness and distinctiveness of Hong Kong. And how does it respond? It's very hard because we don't have the influence, or in many cases, we have competing interests. So I just think what this means to me, and this probably puts me in a certain camp, But it's very hard for these issues to be at the forefront of American foreign policy, given that we've got competing concerns overseas, limited influence, and our own track record at home ain't perfect. So this gets into questions both of reliability, but also moral standing. So yeah, I'd say they've taken a hit, but look what happened yesterday. You have this announcement. President went out yesterday afternoon of this new agreement, the United States, Australia, and the UK, a new defense cooperation agreement to essentially deal with the Chinese challenge in Asia. So that says to me that Australia, for one, just bet big time on the United States. Because what they did in the process, their ability to get croissants or anything else from France, shall we say, has been destroyed since they canceled their contract to get the French diesel submarines in favor of American nuclear submarines. But Australia just put in its lot with us. Post-Brexit UK, in many ways, is putting in its lot with us more. So I think these things don't work on switches. They're more dials, they're more trends. So we've introduced a greater degree of uncertainty. And I think that's a fact. But I think I get asked a lot, given my job, and I said, I think it's a mistake for foreign governments to view us through the prism of a single event. So to view us through the prism or lens of Afghanistan and say, because of what you did there, we can't count. I think that's just way too narrow a way to think about the United States.
Last topic, Israel. So we're, I don't know, some months into the new Israeli government. I know this isn't American foreign policy, but I'm curious with, and there have been different signs as to whether or not, I mean, on the one hand, it's this fabulous and fascinating moment where you have Lapid and Bennett from very different political pedigrees working together for the greater good on Israel. On the other hand, I never know when I go on Times of Israel, is it Gantz, is it Lapid, is it, where are we vis-a-vis Iran? And so I'm just wondering, any reflections thus far into this Israeli, any different directions? It's the first time in a long time that Netanyahu has not been the prime minister.
Who?
Any?
Well, look, one is, if you look at the new government, it's still there. And anytime you've got this type of an unwieldy coalition, it's kind of the line, 80% of life is showing up. In this case, 80% of life is staying in office. So not bad.
And someone asked me how my sermon was, and I said, well, they haven't changed the locks. Still here.
Is that L-O-C-K-S? I can't make food jokes on Yom Kippur. I apologize. In terms of the Palestinian issue, you've got a prime minister who doesn't favor a two-state solution. Despite that, I actually think it doesn't preclude doing some things in that space, because you could do all sorts of things short of that. We're not even close to final status now. So there's things that can and should be done. And I think there's some potential there. And I had met yesterday with the King of Jordan. He was here. I think there's some things going on. So just because there's no agreement on the end point doesn't mean there's no chance for progress on some intermediate steps. And it's actually a much smarter way to go, because if you're an all-or-nothing diplomacy would give you nothing. So sometimes you've got to take, as Jim Baker used to say, you got to crawl before you walk and walk before you run. Well, in the Middle East now, we've got to crawl. But crawling in the right direction would be a welcome change. So I think there's some possibilities there. And the problem is not just the Israeli side. I'm not sure you've got a Palestinian partner, given the lack of legitimacy, given the absence of elections, the age, the corruption. My guess is bigger things are going to have to wait for changes on the Palestinian side. But again, it doesn't preclude smaller things. I think in the meantime, though, you've got the normalizations going on under the rubric of the so-called Abraham Accords. And then I think the continuity in Israel is the toughness on Iran. And this prime minister has talked about 1,000 cuts. So what you're clearly having an Israeli government that will continue to take active measures whenever it can to slow down the Iranian program, or to deal with Iran in Syria, or to deal with something in the Gulf. But that's at best limiting the damage. That's at best. So one of the words I almost never use is solutions. These aren't problems. These are situations. And so there's no solution. Regime change is not coming to Tehran. You're not going to have a bunch of guys running that country who are going to be wonderful. So and the question, but I do think, so the Israelis for now have decided not to have a massive confrontation with Iran, but to do what they can to push back a little, but keep them on their heels. We'll see, but sooner or later, I think there'll be some real showdowns there. And the question is, does it spill over then into Lebanon and all the threats that poses to Israel? And Lebanon, by the way, could be the next big crisis in the Middle East. We don't talk about it. Lebanon's about this close to the edge as a failed state. And what would be the consequences of that? And you've already got 3 failed states in the region, essentially, with Libya and Yemen and Syria. So this part of the world, Israel chose a lousy neighborhood, and that hasn't changed. But I actually think potentially a little bit of positive movement on the Palestinian front. And I think the bigger issue will either be Lebanon or Iran, and the two are obviously intimately connected.
Great. Okay, let's see some hands and some questions. Mara and Rabbi, do we have microphones? So I see a lot of hands. I like young people more. Caroline, right there. So Caroline, a recent college graduate.
You could have made a lot of friends if you had called on someone of a certain age at that point.
Oh no, I'm going to play into that momentarily.
Sorry to step on your line.
Sure. So I think, Rabbi, you talked in your sermon about this morning, and I've read the Plato, I've read the Hannah Arendt. You see democracies become demagogueries or fascist states all the time, and so clear in the Times, in New York Times, Wall Street Journal, whatever you read now, that there's so many things in our country that look like they're heading towards that. But I wanted to know if you had any example of states that looked like ours and did not become Hitler's Germany.
Did not what?
Did not become Hitler's Germany. Like, when do you see states on the brink that go the other way? And what in our country right now is more promising and is something to be fostered?
Okay. Well, the rabbi spoke to this in his sermon last night. And it's one of the reasons I'm pretty reluctant to use German and Hitler metaphors is we all have a stake in that being a historical one-off. So I work from that assumption. I don't assume it, but I pretty much work from it. And that kind of extremism. But democratic backsliding, that happened, that's baked into the cake of democracy. When democracies are built, there's the famous line when Benjamin Franklin was leaving the Constitutional Convention. And someone came up to him and said, well, what do you guys decide? What do we have? And he said, a republic. And then he paused for a minute and he said, if you can keep it. So I think implicit in democracy is its vulnerability. President Biden, one of the best speeches he gave early on in his presidency, when he described democracies as hard. They are. They are really tough. And ours was designed, the Constitution was our second attempt, if you remember, after the Articles, to create a more perfect union. It was a pretty quick recognition that the first effort was a failure. And that was a country then of 3 million people. 3 million people. Now we're 330 million people. We're continental. Technology's changed. So the pressure on democracies to evolve is enormous. And a lot of these technologies, like social media, haven't made it any easier. And the demographic changes have made governing very hard, but it's very hard to correct what's wrong in our democracy because any conceivable reform you would introduce advantages some and disadvantages others. And it's good you're sitting down because shockingly enough, those who fear they would be disadvantaged tend to resist those reforms. So I think we're in I won't sugarcoat it, I think we're in a tough place in American democracy, but nothing's inevitable. And democracies, again, the great structural advantage of democracies is their ability to self-correct. So we had, after the 2007-8 financial crisis, we introduced certain reforms. President Biden, if he were sitting here, would say the decision in Afghanistan that he just made. I disagreed with him, but he would say that's a form of self-correction. And again, the fact that when democracies survive hundreds of years, that shows their ability to adapt. I think that's in its DNA. The problem is that democracies also get somewhat sclerotic, like the rest of us. And the question is, are we willing and able to reform? And I think that's an open question. What concerns me is we're not doing some of the things we need to do in order to increase the odds. And the fact, I'll just give my own one particular thing. The fact that most Americans who go to school can graduate from their high schools or their colleges without having taken a basic course on American citizenship, on American civics. That, to me, is fundamentally wrong. You know, we spend our time every Passover. We don't take for granted as Jews that the tradition of the Exodus, it comes with the DNA. It doesn't. So what we do, we have the Haggadah and we teach the story because it's central to the Jewish experience to know the story, l'dor l'dor, pass it on from generation to generation. We're not doing that as Americans. We have to be just as committed as distilling the essence of American democracy and then making sure this is part of the required curriculum for every high schooler and every college kid. We've got to do that, and we're not doing that. So the answer is we're not where we want to be as a society, but there are avenues for change. The real question is whether we avail ourselves of them.
Let's get another question here. Yes, please. Mr. Kogan. Yes. Everyone's young in heart. But let's keep them to questions so we get as many as we can.
Because of Afghanistan and other indications of Americans faltering in our foreign commitments, China, well, what do you think the chances are of China making a significant move against Taiwan? Yep. And what do we do under those circumstances?
Look, it's the big question, and the question of might China make a move against Taiwan? It's the big debate in the foreign policy establishment. Growing concern about it, given everything from Chinese capabilities have built up, their rhetoric's gotten rougher, their military flights and exercises have gotten more active. I don't know. You can only look at capabilities. You can never predict intentions. So I don't. And we have, for the last 40 years, we have discouraged or deterred any such Chinese activities against Taiwan, because we've basically said you cannot rule out the possibility that we will come to Taiwan's defense. That's wired into the so-called Taiwan Relations Act. I would actually make that more explicit. I would actually build up our capabilities. I think it's essential that China not be tempted to move against Taiwan and that it fail if it does. And I think there are things we need to be doing to bolster deterrence. Japan is now working more closely with us, which is a big, big deal. Japan is probably the most, it's kind of the Rodney Dangerfield of countries. People forget it's still the world's third largest economy, one of the world's largest militaries. So the fact that Japan is now increasingly seized with this issue, the Australia announcement yesterday. But I think we need to be smart diplomatically. I don't think we ought to be reckless in what we say and do. I don't want to provoke a crisis. I would much prefer to avoid one. And I think you avoid it by not doing reckless things, but by showing your willingness and capability to resist if need be. But we also, and one last thing, we also need to think about history happens not just because of premeditated things. The least likely scenario might be a Chinese amphibious assault across the straits into Taiwan. But just say tomorrow, for whatever reason, the Chinese scramble some planes and they send them near Taiwan, and Chinese planes are flown by 18-year-old kids from some Chinese city, and Taiwan scrambles fighters and they're flown by some 18-year-old from there, and there's an incident. What worries me, one, an incident can happen. Two, is then the ability of the three parties, the United States, China, Taiwan, to manage things. And I think there's a question mark. So I worry about this more as a result of events than I do necessarily of something that's cold and out of the blue. But bottom line is, it is high on everybody's charts of interests.
Okay, great. Yes. Oh, hold on, Rachel. We'll get a...
So you mentioned that you don't agree with Biden pulling out of Afghanistan.
Could you take our mask off just for 1 second? Am I violating protocol? I can't.
You mentioned that you don't agree with Biden pulling troops out of Afghanistan. What would you have done differently to make the transition more seamless and less chaotic?
Okay, well, the question was about Afghanistan and what I would have done differently than the president. I would not have left. I'll make a very long story short. By the time President Biden became president, we had roughly 2,500, 3,000 troops in Afghanistan. U.S. casualties were way down, not simply as a result of the February 2020 agreement between the Trump administration and the Taliban. U.S. casualties had gone down dramatically after the end of 2014. Why? U.S. participation in combat operations came to an end then. So I actually thought that by the time President Biden became president, we had reached finally, after years of doing way too much and too much of the wrong stuff in Afghanistan, I finally thought we had reached a relatively modest level of American presence, 3,000 Americans plus or minus, plus the contractors, plus 8,000 allied troops, plus support for the Afghans, that I thought not that you were never going to win the war, you were never going to have peace, but you could have averted what's happened, which was the collapse of the government and the humanitarian crisis that we've seen. So I thought the president inherited a situation that was sustainable at a reasonable cost. He disagreed. He was concerned that if we didn't leave, that the cost of staying would go up, and that he would come under then pressure to reinforce, to send tens and tens of thousands of new soldiers back into Afghanistan. So in order to avoid that scenario, he decided to leave. Again, I thought it assumed the worst about staying and the best about leaving. And so I was not on board with that, but he made the decision.
Okay, I think we have time for about one more question. Michael, is that Michael? I can't see, the lights are bright. Oh, there's a microphone coming right there. Oh, I'm sorry. All right, so we'll do really quick, 1, 2.
The question is, we talk about, now all the immigration coming from Afghanistan, what we're going to do with them. What about our southern border? We had a stay-in-place agreement. We had the Central American countries not coming. Now, we went from 17,000 to over 220,000 roughly every single month. Many tested, overpowering our border patrol because they have COVID.
All right, Michael, so the question is the southern border.
Yes.
Thank you. Look, southern border's a real issue. It's happening for several reasons. One is there was some verbal signaling during the campaign, which was unfortunate by the administration, that was more welcoming. COVID, by the way, this is one of the national security consequences of not having exported more vaccines. There's a vaccine gap. And as a result, both a health gap and an economic gap between the United States and a lot of countries in Latin America, and that's motivating people to head north. There's also what the vice president calls the root causes phenomena, crime, cartels. So there's not, again, there's not a single solution. I think, our asylum policy is broken in lots of ways. I would basically think we've got to work this lots of ways with vaccines, a long-term program of building up what I call nation building or state building in some of these countries, like what we did in Colombia. But we've got to be, again, I think we've got to have a strict border policy. I think that we need comprehensive immigration reform. And immigration, 30-second advertisement. Immigration's been one of the main reasons this country is as successful as it is. It is a fantastic engine of innovation and of economic activity, of cultural richness. And so we need, I believe, a modern immigration policy where the best and brightest continue to come to the United States. As much as I like Canada and Australia and New Zealand, I don't want them all to go there. I would like people to keep coming here. We need we need a process of normalizing the legal status of the 13 million people who are living here without a proper legal status, without normal lives. And then we've got to have security at the border. And we also, probably fourth, we want to resist the pressure for people to come here. NAFTA, the trade agreement, was the single best border control policy we had. Why? Because it evened out economic growth rates. And people no longer felt the pressure to leave places like Mexico. So if we have a much more open-ended, imaginative economic policy with trade and investment, that will also help. There's no single bullet here, but there are things we've got to do in several domains.
All right, Your Honor, please.
Nuclear proliferation.
Yeah, I'm against it, by the way.
The question is nuclear proliferation?
In Asia,
Yeah.
the subcontinent,
Sure.
and the Middle
Well-
East, and what would you do to prevent it?
Okay, well, nuclear proliferation. Look, at the moment, you've got the 5 original nuclear powers, Russia, China, the United States, Britain, and France, and largely through arms control, the United States and Russia sort of have it somewhat, I wouldn't say under control, but somewhat limited. New innovation, the question is, can we cap that? China is basically an outlier here. So one question is whether China can start coming under some of these agreements. This is called vertical proliferation. How do you limit the increase in quantity and quality of inventories for countries that have already crossed the threshold? Then you've got the North Koreas, the Indias, the Pakistans, and the Israels, the 4 other countries that have nuclear weapons. And I think there, I worry about continued growth. I worry about potential use. I worry in places like Pakistan about, imagine in 10 years a radicalized Pakistan because of Afghanistan, what that could mean for Pakistan's 200 nuclear weapons. North Korea right now is my biggest concern because both the arsenal and delivery systems are growing at a fairly rapid rate. And then Iran, we've already talked about. So it's, again, this is, kind of comes back to where we began. This is a global phenomena, and the machinery the world put in place to deal with proliferation, in particular the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which goes back about 50 years now, is inadequate. So we've got these technological and geopolitical trends, and we haven't come up with ways of sufficiently or satisfactorily dealing with them. It's scary. It's something that people... I guess I've gone on too long because you're pulling
No, we got you.
But it's, look, it doesn't get a lot of attention because it's been in the background for 50 years, but it doesn't mean it's gone away, if anything, I think. And if North Korea keeps growing, if Iran keeps growing, if people have doubts about the United States, that will lead to lots of other countries deciding that they too may have to go down that path. One of the reasons, look, you want to have the United States trusted and seen as a dependable security partner, is I don't want other countries to feel that they have to take matters into their own hands. As bad as, say, the Middle East has been, can you imagine a Middle East where Iran, Turkey, Egypt, and others also had nuclear weapons? It'd be a nightmare. We do not want to get to that point.
All right. So, rabbinic prerogative as we close.
Yes, sir.
Is there anyone that you get, like, starry-eyed meeting? Like, you can just drop in a sentence like, yeah, I was having coffee with the King of Jordan. Like, is there anyone that you come home to Susan and you're like, you will not in a million years believe who I just spoke to? Or is it just like, yeah, so I was speaking to the blah, blah, blah.
It'll be the conversation at breakfast tonight, after my conversation with you.
If you could make the vow to me that next time you're speaking to a head of state, sometime in that conversation, just be like, I was speaking to my rabbi the other day. And that would make me feel good.
I will work it in. In my career, I would say, appropriately enough, the non-American who I didn't get starry-eyed with, but he was the person who I thought was the single most impressive individual I was fortunate to do business with was Itzhak Rabin. I actually met my wife at a reception at the Israeli ambassador's home in Washington, and I think it was 1989? Yeah, okay, it was good. I get points for that. And he was defense minister then. And that he was able to change to the degree he did. And when he said this wasn't easy for him, the idea that given his background, he could also, I guess, ultimately emerge as an effective, reluctant peacemaker. What an extraordinary man. And so that, again, not starry-eyed, but he was as impressive as, but also, like, I was lucky. I was in government at a time where there were people like him or Gorbachev, who, real history makers. Mandela, de Klerk, someone who doesn't get the credit. People always talk about Nelson Mandela for good reason. Nelson Mandela, though, only succeeded in a peaceful change because he had F.W. de Klerk as a partner on the other side. A little bit like Sadat and Begin. peace tends to require great people on both sides of the equation. One great person alone ain't gonna do it. I recently met the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Actually, not, I met virtually. We did a council meeting. She was wildly impressive. This month, Chancellor Merkel is leaving the scene. And again, maybe not the most exciting person, but people will miss her. The stability she brought to Germany and the leadership at times she brought to Europe. I think we'll probably miss it. And then here are lots of people. The person I was close to, actually, I thought of it during the Yitzka service, Brent Scowcroft, who was one of my closest friends, as close as I've had to a mentor. He passed away this past year. And just, again, it shows...
Brent Snowcroft.
Brent was the national security advisor twice, the only person to have the job twice, both for Gerald Ford and for Bush 41. And just, one of the most talented civil servants this country has ever known, but also the Jim Bakers and others. We've been lucky, this country. We've produced, historically, just people of rare talent. And what was so good is the best and brightest went into public service. And one of my goals, I had a conversation over the weekend at this wedding about it, was how do we get the best and brightest of this generation also to do that? And I want a few to go into the rabbinate. I want to continue that tradition. But also I'd like as much as I like Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan, I want the best and the brightest also to go into public service at whatever level. I want to make that exciting.
Thank you. Dr. Haas, thank you so much. To you and your family, a sweet and health-filled new year. To those who are here, as I said last night, as the Blues Brothers said long before me, you don't have to go home, but you just can't stay here. We're going to let people make ARC visits momentarily, and we need to clear the room. So we'll open up the 87th Street doors, and I wish everyone a good afternoon. We'll begin Mincha after the ARC visits, I believe, in about an hour or so.